The phone buzzed so sharply in my pocket that it felt like a warning, not a call. I was standing outside a makeshift clinic in a dusty little village halfway across the world, where the air shimmered with heat, and children's laughter echoed from somewhere behind the huts. For a second I thought of ignoring it, but then I saw the name on the screen and my stomach dropped like a stone. Richard, my stepfather. Even saying his name, even just seeing those letters glowing on the screen sent a heaviness through my chest. He had been a thorn in my life for so many years that by now I had learned his calls rarely carried good news. Usually they carried chaos, and yet I answered. Some mixture of duty and habit, maybe even a fragile thread of hope, made me swipe the screen. "Hello," I said, my voice steady though inside I braced myself. "Catherine." His tone was too cheerful, falsely bright. "I thought you'd want to know I've sold the mountain cabin." I froze. My blood seemed to stop moving. "You, what? Sold it?" he repeated casually, as if he were telling me about groceries. Then came his laugh, smug, hollow, cruel. "It's for the greater good." "Well, my good." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. The cabin wasn't just wood and stone, it was the one place where I could breathe, the place that carried the last traces of my mother's presence, the place I had poured my savings, sweat and soul into. Hearing him talk about it like a poker chip in one of his schemes made something inside me ignite. "You had no right," I said, my voice trembling but sharp enough to cut. "Relax," he drawled. "You're always off saving the world somewhere. What's the point of clinging to a cabin you never enjoy?" It was an easy way to clear my debts. "You'll thank me later." "I'll thank you when hell freezes over," I snapped and hung up before his laughter could poison me any further. For a long while I paced the dirt outside the clinic, my heart hammering, my chest burning. That man's audacity knew no limits. He thought he could play God with what wasn't his like he always had. But what he didn't know, what I clung to now like a lifeline, was that the cabin wasn't his to sell. It wasn't even mine alone. My best friend Laura was co-owner. By law, by contract, Richard's little sale was worthless without her consent. Still, fury raged through me. He hadn't just tried to steal property. He had tried to rob me of something sacred, something that had carried me through grief after my mother died. Something that had been my sanctuary, in a world that never stopped demanding. I remembered summer evenings catching fireflies near the porch. I remembered the way my mother's laughter filled the kitchen the first year she brought me there. The smell of pine, the feel of the wood under my hands when Laura and I restored it together. That place was me, and he had tried to take it. My fingers shook as I tapped Laura's name. She picked up, her voice warm and steady as always. "Kathy. How's the assignment?" "Richard sold the cabin," I blurted. There was silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "He what?" "He claims he needed the money for gambling debts." I swallowed the bitterness. "But he can't do it, Laura. Our agreement won't let him." "You're right," she said, her tones snapping from shock to steel. "That man has no shame. Don't worry, we'll fight this together." I exhaled, my pulse slowing though the anger still burned. Richard thought distance would protect him, that I was still the frightened 15-year-old girl who once cowered when he raised his voice. But he was wrong. I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a woman now, one who had built a career, forged friendships, faced death in disaster zones, and returned stronger every time. And if Richard thought he could rip away the last piece of my mother I had left, he was about to find out how wrong he was. That night, back in the quiet of my tent, I opened my journal and wrote furiously. Every line was a reminder of why the cabin mattered. The way Laura and I painted the porch one summer, our laughter echoing into the forest. The nights I sat by the fire, tears streaming, as I tried to make sense of life after my mother's funeral. The hikes, the views, the memories stitched into every corner of that home. It wasn't just a cabin, it was my anchor. And Richard had just declared war on the only piece of stability I had left. The next day, Laura confirmed what I already knew: the sale wasn't valid. Legally, he had nothing. But that wasn't enough for me, because Richard never stopped at one lie. He never stopped at one theft. He always pressed, always tested, always manipulated until someone broke. I had let him break me before, but this time it was going to be different. I finished my assignment with a fire in my veins, then booked the first flight home. The closer I got, the more determined I became. Richard wanted a fight, and I was ready to give him one, but not the way he expected. No screaming, no chaos. I'd use the one weapon he never respected: the truth. And this time, the truth was on my side. When the plane touched down, the city lights looked like scattered embers, 1,000 tiny fires holding their breath. I rode home in silence, forehead on the window, watching my reflection tremble every time the car hit a pothole. Keys in the door, stale air in the hallway, a stack of mail like a silent accusation on the floor. I set my bag down and just stood there listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of my own heartbeat. Home was supposed to feel safe. Instead, it felt like the last room left before the cliff. My phone lit up. Richard. For a heartbeat, I thought of letting it ring out, of starving his voice of oxygen. But avoidance was how he'd always won. I swiped. Well, he said, syrup thick over a rusted blade, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter. Back to reality. What do you want? I asked flat. Just checking you got the good news. The cabin situation done and dusted. He chuckled, but there was a tremor inside it, the way a badly built deck groans under its own weight. It isn't done, I told him. You can't sell what you don't own. Laura and I checked the records. No transfer, no consent, no sale. Silence. The kind that pulls the air out of a room. Then dangerously low. You think you're clever? No, I said, turning on the kitchen light and squinting against the glare. I'm informed. He hung up first. The old tactic, leave me with the noise of absence, forced me to call back. I didn't. Instead, I opened my laptop and the folder Laura had shared. There it was, the co-ownership agreement we'd signed at her dining table with coffee stains on the margins. Neither party may transfer, encumber, or sell without the other's written consent. Our signatures solid as iron rails. I pressed my thumb to my mother's ring, the one I wore on a chain when I traveled, and felt a steadiness return to my spine. There was a knock at the door the next morning, sharp and titled. I knew who it was before I opened it. Richard stepped in without waiting, like he always had, with boundaries, as if they were suggestions for other people. He smelled like aftershave and stale coffee, and the faint metallic tang of desperation. Listen. He began, dropping into a chair as though he'd paid the rent. You're overreacting. I was in a tight spot. The people I owe money to, well, let's say they don't send friendly reminders. He lifted his hands, palms up, the soft show of a small-time magician. It's just a cabin. You're barely there. It's not just a cabin, I said evenly. It's mine, ours, and you tried to steal it. Borrow, he corrected quickly, the words snapping off his tongue. A lie polished by use. If my luck had turned, I would have made it right. You know I would have. That was the cruelty of Richard. He always framed harm as favor theft, as caretaking abuse, as inevitable weather no one could control. And my mother had smoothed it all over while I was a teenager, softened his rages, told me he meant well, that if I tried not to provoke him, the storms would pass. The part of me that had believed her for so long flickered, and then died. Leave, I said, surprising myself with the calm in my voice. This isn't a discussion. And if you contact any buyer again, I will take every legal step available to me. For a flash, his face crumpled like a mask, tugged crooked, and I saw something raw, fear maybe, or the fury of a man not used to hearing the word no. He stood abruptly, jaw grinding, and went out the door so hard my picture frames shivered. I called Laura. He came here, I said, pacing, tried to sell me a story. Let him, she said, fierce. I talked to a lawyer. We're sending a cease and desist today. I also pulled the county logs again. Still no official transfer. But there's a name on a memorandum, some real estate flipper. I'm reaching out to the agent. An hour later, Laura looped me into a call with the agent, her voice tight with relief and embarrassment. He assured me he had full authority, the woman confessed. When the paperwork showed only one signature, I flagged it. The buyer hasn't paid in full. I can share whatever you need. When the email came through scanned documents, Richard's sloppy signature, a handwritten payment schedule that looked like it had been drafted on a diner napkin, something shifted in me. Anger cooled into focus. It wasn't just indignation anymore. It was a plan. Laura's lawyer drafted the letter, precise, cold, irrefutable. Any further attempt to convey interest in the property would trigger legal action. We sent it registered and watched the tracking updates like weather radar before a storm. That night I drove to the mountains. The road curved upward, old pines knitting the sky together, shadows flickering over the hood of my car. When I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked, a welcome I felt in my bones. Inside, the air was cool and familiar, wood smoke ghosting the rafters, cedar from the closet door, the faint soap I'd always used on the stone hearth. I sat cross-legged by the fireplace and let myself cry for the first time, not only for the near loss of the cabin, but for every time I'd minimized his harm to keep the peace my mother begged for. Grief tipped into resolve. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number Laura had given me, the local detective she knew from a neighborhood watch committee, the one who returned calls on weekends and didn't roll his eyes at family matters. I told him everything. He listened, asked for the files, and gave me a case number that felt like a small solid anchor dropped into deep water. The next morning Richard called again. Venom strained through panic. "Do you have any idea what you've started?" he hissed. "You're going to ruin." "No," I said, staring out at a blue seam of mountains steady as scripture. "I'm gonna stop it." I hung up. The forest exhaled. A jay scolded somewhere in the trees, insistent and alive. For the first time in a long time I felt the floor under my feet hold. Detective Miller's voice was steady, clipped and professional when he called back 2 days later. "Miss Daniels, I've reviewed the documents you and Miss Langley provided. It's clear the attempted sale was unauthorized. Based on the evidence, we can proceed with a formal investigation." Something inside me unclenched, though my hands trembled as I gripped the phone tighter. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Do it, please. I want him held accountable. I want him." For years I had swallowed his manipulations, endured his guilt trips, bent myself into silence, for the sake of keeping the family from splitting at the seams. But in that moment I knew I was done carrying the weight of his choices. Miller assured me they'd contact the buyer, explain the situation, and escalate to charges if Richard interfered again. After the call, I leaned back against the cabin wall, heart racing. The boards were cool and solid at my back, grounding me. This was happening. For once I wasn't on the defensive, I was choosing to fight. 2 days later, Richard's voice ripped through the lines, seething and jagged. "Do you even realize what you've done, Catherine? You're ruining everything." "No, Richard," I said calmly, surprising even myself with the steadiness in my tone. "I'm protecting what's mine. You did this to yourself." "You ungrateful brat," he spat. "I stepped in when your mother couldn't handle things. I kept a roof over your head, and this is how you repay me." I laughed bitterly, years of swallowed resentment spilling out at once. "You didn't step in. You took over. You lied. You used. You drained. And now finally someone is calling you out." His breathing grew heavier, louder, angrier, but I cut him off. "If you have more to say, take it up with my lawyer." I ended the call, my hand shaking, but not from fear, from release. That night I couldn't sleep. Memories pressed and old scenes replaying with brutal clarity. Me at 15, watching Richard slam a fist against the table when my mother disagreed with him. Me at 20, quietly covering a debt he forgot to pay, too ashamed to tell anyone. Me at 25, crying in the cabin after another phone call that left me feeling small and responsible for his endless chaos. But now at 32, sitting in the glow of a fire I built with my own hands, I realized something I should have known long ago. His choices were his, not mine, to clean up. When Detective Miller called again, it was to tell me the buyer had backed out. The sale was officially void. Relief swept through me like a tidal wave, carrying weeks of tension out into the night. "So the cabin is safe?" I asked, barely trusting the words. "Yes," he confirmed. "Legally it remains yours and Miss Langley's, but we'll keep the case open. Fraudulent misrepresentation is serious. Do you wish to press charges?" I hesitated only long enough to feel the weight of the decision. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want him held accountable." Laura cried out in joy when I told her. "It's about time someone stood up to him," she said, her voice thick with pride. Later that evening, I sat alone in the cabin, the firelight flickering across the old photographs on the mantel. My mother's smiling face, Laura and me after our first renovation weekend, a faded picture of me at 16 with paint on my cheeks. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger, whispering to my mother's memory, "I did it, Mom." I finally stood up. Days blurred into a rhythm of paperwork, lawyer calls, and waiting. Each step forward felt like a stone in a wall I was building brick by brick between myself and Richard's control. A week later, Miller called again, his tone firmer than before. Miss Daniels, I wanted to let you know your stepfather has been formally charged with attempted property theft and fraudulent misrepresentation. The evidence is strong. He'll be required to appear in court. I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me. Relief, vindication, and buried beneath them a quiet sadness. Richard had been a constant in my life, an ugly, destructive one, but constant all the same. Now he would face a courtroom instead of a kitchen table. That night Laura drove up with a bottle of wine. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky with amber and violet. The air was sharp with pine and the silence was healing instead of heavy. To us, she said, raising her glass, and to never letting anyone push us around again. I clinked my glass against hers, a soft laugh breaking through the tightness in my chest. To us. We talked long into the night, the cabin standing around us like a fortress we had reclaimed. As the stars pricked the sky, I felt the truth settle deep in my bones. This wasn't just about the cabin, it was about me. It was about deciding my boundaries were worth defending no matter who crossed them. Richard had underestimated me for the last time. A week later, Detective Miller's number appeared on my phone again. I answered with a knot in my stomach, bracing for more upheaval. Instead, his voice carried a certainty that felt like a steady hand on my shoulder. Miss Daniels, I wanted you to know we've filed the charges formally. Your stepfather is facing counts of fraudulent misrepresentation and attempted theft of property. He'll be summoned to appear in court. Based on the evidence, the case is strong. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Relief and sorrow collided inside me, twisting into something bittersweet. Thank you, I whispered, blinking hard. It takes courage to do what you've done, Miller said. It's never easy to stand up to family. After the call ended, I sat in silence, staring out at the cabin porch where evening shadows lengthened into the trees. Richard's shadow had loomed over me for half my life, bending me into silence, forcing me into corners. But now finally the law itself stood between us. The next morning Laura drove up to celebrate. She came armed with her usual warmth, 2 glasses and a bottle of red wine. We sat on the porch, the mountains stretching endlessly in front of us. The air smelled of pine and earth, grounding me. To us, she said, lifting her glass with a mischievous grin, and to not letting anyone walk all over us again. I laughed, a real laugh this time, unburdened and bright. To us, I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. We sat there for hours, letting the crisp night wrap around us. The stars emerged bold and countless, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel weighed down. Instead, I felt light, almost free. As we talked, I found myself reflecting on the long years I had spent trying to avoid conflict, to smooth over tensions, especially with Richard. I had mistaken endurance for peace. But now I realized peace was not the absence of conflict. Peace was standing firm in the storm, refusing to let yourself be swept away. You know, Laura said suddenly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. This cabin has always been more than just walls and a roof. It's a symbol of what we've built, of who you've become. Don't ever let anyone take that from you again. Her words hit me deep, like they were carved into my bones. She was right. This place wasn't just property. It was my independence, my resilience, my claim to a life that was truly mine. Later that night, after Laura had gone home, I sat alone by the fire. The crackle of the logs, the soft warmth filling the room, it wrapped around me like a blanket. I let the tears come, not from sadness this time, but from release. Richard's betrayal had pushed me into a corner I never wanted to face. But in fighting back, I had discovered a strength I didn't know lived inside me. The cabin was safe. My boundaries had been set. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was steering my life instead of surviving someone else's wreckage. Weeks slipped by. Life found a rhythm again, steady and almost sweet. On weekends, Laura and I worked on small renovations, patching the roof, painting the porch, planting wildflowers along the edge of the property. Each brushstroke, each nail hammered into wood, felt like reclaiming more than a building. It was reclaiming me. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the mountains gold, Laura asked, "So what's next for you, Kathy? You've stood up to Richard, you've protected the cabin, what now?" I thought about her question, letting the silence hold me before the answer came. "I'm going to keep doing what I love. Traveling, volunteering, living my life on my terms. But this time, I'm not letting anyone else dictate how I live it. Laura smiled and raised her glass. To that she said, and I knew deep down I meant it. That night as the stars appeared one by one over the mountains, I stood on the porch inhaling the cool, pine-scented air. For the first time in years, I felt fully at home, not just in the cabin, but in my own skin. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet rebirth. The storm had passed, and though its debris still lingered, I finally had the space to breathe. I spent more time at the cabin than I had in years, letting the stillness of the mountains mend what Richard had fractured inside me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of pine needles in the wind, reminded me of what I'd fought so hard to protect. News about Richard filtered in slowly. My mother called once, her voice hesitant, unsure. "You know how he gets, Catherine," she murmured, that old reflex to excuse him rising like a ghost. But even she sounded tired of her own defense. "I do know," I said firmly, "and that's why I did what I had to do." For the first time she didn't argue. There was only a long sigh, then a quiet, "I hope you find peace." "I already have," I told her, and I meant it. The court process was still unfolding, but Richard's power over me had already dissolved. He couldn't guilt me, couldn't manipulate me, couldn't barter with what wasn't his. The charges stood between us now, a wall of accountability he couldn't charm or bully his way through. Laura and I threw ourselves into restoring the cabin, almost as if the repairs were metaphors for our lives. We sanded rough edges, patched broken pieces, replaced what was rotting, and strengthened what could be saved. With each small project I felt more whole, more mine. One evening as the sunset painted the sky in strokes of fire and rose, I sat on the porch and thought about everything that had led me here. Richard's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also forced me to confront something I had avoided for too long, my own silence, my own willingness to endure instead of resist. I realized now that true strength wasn't in how much pain I could withstand, but in how fiercely I could defend my own worth. When the trial date was set, I felt no fear, only resolve. Richard would finally stand before a judge, stripped of the charm he'd wielded like a weapon, and face the truth he had spent his life outrunning. For once the consequences were his alone. The night before the hearing, I sat in front of the fireplace with Laura by my side. She poured us each a glass of wine and said softly, "No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already won. You stood up to him. You reclaimed yourself." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes because she was right. The outcome no longer defined me. The fight itself had changed me. In the end, Richard's downfall wasn't the courtroom, it was me. The girl who had once cowered had grown into a woman who stood tall, and he couldn't undo that. As the weeks stretched into months, I carried the lesson everywhere I went. The cabin stood as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no one had the right to decide my value, my peace, or my future. I had faced betrayal, I had endured the storm, and I had come out stronger than I ever believed I could. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to my story to remember, it's this: you are allowed to protect what matters to you. You are allowed to draw lines, to say no, to demand respect. Even if the person you're standing up to is family, especially then, because family doesn't excuse betrayal, and blood doesn't excuse theft. Tonight, as I sit here watching the flames dance in the fireplace, I feel a calm I've never known before. Richard no longer owns a piece of me. The fear, the guilt, the silence, they're gone. What remains is strength. What remains is me. So if my story resonates with you, if you've ever faced betrayal, if you've ever fought to protect what was yours, if you've ever had to stand against someone you thought you couldn't, then I want you to do one thing for me. Please. Like this video if my journey touched you. Share it with someone who might need the courage to fight back. Subscribe so you won't miss the stories. I continue to share stories of resilience, betrayal, and survival. And leave a comment below. Tell me your story, your strength, your moment of reclaiming yourself, because we are not alone, and neither are you.